the asylum lawyer that you're considering hiring is demanding payment in cash, you should probably keep looking.
You see, that's a bad sign because they're probably trying to avoid paying taxes illegally.
If they're willing to defraud the government, there's a good chance they're willing to defraud you.
At minimum, it's a red flag. They're probably pretty dishonest.
Trust me when I say that you want your asylum lawyer to be honest. Cutting corners will only end up hurting you.
Sham immigration lawyers to lose cash in crackdown on asylum and visa abuses. Welcome to British News Blog, where we cut through the noise and deliver the political stories that actually matter. If you're not already subscribed, do hit that button now because what we're about to discuss affects the very integrity of our immigration system. And frankly, you won't want to miss what comes next. Right, let's get straight to it. The government has just unveiled what they're calling a game-changing crackdown on rogue immigration advisors, and the numbers involved are frankly staggering. We're not talking about a few dodgy solicitors operating out of back offices. We're talking about criminal enterprises that have extracted millions from vulnerable migrants whilst simultaneously making an absolute mockery of our legal system. The Home Office has announced that the Immigration Advice Authority will now possess powers that until now have been the exclusive domain of law enforcement. These aren't just regulatory slaps on the wrist. These are serious financial weapons designed to dismantle what has become, in effect, an entire shadow industry built on exploitation and fraud. Here's what's particularly striking about this development. The Immigration Advice Authority will now be able to trace assets, freeze bank accounts, claw back illegally obtained earnings, and bring offenders to justice without even requiring police support. Let that sink in for a moment. A regulatory body with the powers of a financial crimes unit. This represents a fundamental shift in how seriously the government is taking this problem. And they should be taking it seriously, because the scale of the fraud is breathtaking. One bogus advisor alone raked in over £500,000. Another case saw 3 rogue operators pocket more than £3 million by targeting desperate people online, offering advice on visa applications and deportation challenges that was either worthless or actively harmful. But here's where it gets interesting, and frankly rather clever from a policy perspective. The money seized from these criminal operations won't simply disappear into the Treasury's general coffers. No. Officials have confirmed it will be reinvested directly into frontline policing with the specific aim of shutting down the very networks it once funded. There's a certain poetic justice to that, isn't there? The proceeds of crime being used to fund the mechanisms of border security and law enforcement. It's the sort of circular justice that actually makes practical sense, though one does wonder why it's taken quite this long to implement. If you're finding this valuable, make sure you're subscribed because we'll be tracking exactly how this policy unfolds and whether it delivers on these rather ambitious promises. Now, let's talk about who these people actually are and how they operate, because this isn't just about a few bad apples. These rogue immigration advisors function as middlemen in a much larger ecosystem of immigration system abuse. They are not typically providing legitimate advice that simply falls short of professional standards. They are actively facilitating fraud, creating false documentation, coaching clients on how to deceive immigration officials, and in many cases, simply taking money whilst providing absolutely nothing in return. The term sham immigration lawyers is doing rather a lot of work in that headline, because many of these individuals aren't lawyers at all. They are not solicitors, they are not barristers, they are not even properly registered immigration advisors. They are criminals cosplaying as legal professionals, and they've been doing it with alarming success. The mechanics of these scams follow depressingly familiar patterns. They target vulnerable migrants through social media, often through Facebook groups where people genuinely seeking help congregate. They claim to have special access to the Home Office, insider knowledge, connections that can expedite applications or overturn deportation orders. They demand substantial advance fees, sometimes setting up weekly payment plans to extract maximum value from their victims. They fabricate staff members who are supposedly handling cases. They provide fake business addresses to appear legitimate. And throughout all of this, the victims, already in precarious situations, are being systematically robbed whilst their genuine immigration matters deteriorate through neglect or sabotage. The case of Sukhwinder Singh Kang provides an instructive example of just how brazen these operations can be. Kang posed as a registered Level 3 immigration advisor despite possessing fake qualifications and, by his own admission in legal proceedings, very little actual immigration knowledge whatsoever. His entire operation was built on smoke and mirrors. He used Facebook support groups as his primary source of information, the same Facebook groups his victims were likely also reading. He claimed special access to the Home Office that simply did not exist. He took personal identity documents from his clients, documents they desperately needed for legitimate purposes. He invented fictional staff members. He provided a fake professional premises address. And yet he managed to scam victims out of thousands of pounds before eventually receiving an 18-month suspended sentence for fraud at Southwark Crown Court. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already, because we'll be following whether these new powers actually result in proper prison time for fraudsters rather than suspended sentences. Now, the suspended sentence aspect raises questions that we'll come back to. But first, let's examine what else is changing under this crackdown. The new powers come on top of provisions in the Border Security, Asylum and Immigration Bill, which introduces fines of up to £15,000 for individuals posing as immigration lawyers. Regulators will be empowered to levy these fines against both fraudulent firms and individual advisors who misrepresent themselves as qualified professionals. This is significant because previously, the regulatory framework was more about preventing registered advisors from misconduct rather than stopping unregistered criminals from operating entirely. But there's another element here that's particularly important and has received rather less attention in the coverage. The changes will close what officials describe as a loophole that has allowed individuals currently banned from giving immigration advice to continue doing so by claiming they're operating under supervision. Think about that for a moment. Someone gets caught providing fraudulent immigration advice, gets banned from the profession, and then simply claims they are now working under the supervision of a qualified advisor and carries on as before. It's the regulatory equivalent of a revolving door, and it's been operating in plain sight. The fact that this loophole has existed until now tells you something rather troubling about how seriously this issue has been taken historically. The language coming from the Home Office is notably aggressive. In one sense, this is at least partly driven by broader political pressures around immigration and border security. Officials speak of stripping criminals of their dirty money, of using seized assets to strengthen borders and keep streets safe. There's a clear attempt to frame this as part of the government's wider tough-on-immigration positioning. Whether that political framing sits comfortably with you likely depends on your broader views on immigration policy. But what's harder to argue with is that genuine fraud should be prosecuted and that vulnerable people should be protected from predatory criminals regardless of their immigration status. What's particularly insidious about these scams is how they corrupt the legitimate immigration advice sector and undermine public trust in the system itself. When migrants are being systematically defrauded by people posing as legal professionals, it makes everyone more cynical about immigration claims generally. It provides ammunition for those who claim the system is being abused, even whilst the actual abuse is coming from criminals rather than migrants themselves. The migrants in these cases are victims twice over, first by the criminals who robbed them, and second by a system that may view their botched applications or missed deadlines with suspicion rather than recognizing them as victims of crime. Make sure you're subscribed because these nuances rarely make it into mainstream coverage, and we'll continue breaking down what's actually happening versus what's being claimed. The question now becomes whether these new powers will actually work. Giving the Immigration Advice Authority enhanced enforcement capabilities sounds impressive, but effectiveness depends on resources, political will, and whether the penalties are sufficient to deter what has clearly been a lucrative criminal enterprise. £3 million from one operation of just 3 individuals suggests profit margins that could absorb even significant fines if the chances of being caught remain relatively low. The suspended sentence for Kang, whilst undoubtedly influenced by specific circumstances of his case, doesn't exactly scream deterrent effect. If you can scam thousands of pounds from vulnerable people and walk away with a suspended sentence, the risk-reward calculation may still favor the fraudsters. There's also the matter of international dimension. Many of these operations don't neatly fit within UK borders. Advice may be given remotely. Money may flow through international accounts, The advisors themselves may be based abroad whilst targeting UK-based migrants or those hoping to come to the UK. The Immigration Advice Authority's new powers are presumably territorially limited, which raises questions about how effective they'll be against genuinely sophisticated transnational operations. This isn't to diminish the importance of what's being announced, but rather to inject a dose of realism about the challenges involved. What this crackdown does signal is a recognition that the immigration advice sector has been inadequately regulated and that the consequences of that regulatory failure have been serious. Whether you think immigration should be easier or harder, more or less restricted, surely we can all agree that people seeking to navigate the system, whatever that system looks like, shouldn't be preyed upon by criminals. The fact that it's taken cases involving millions of pounds in fraud to prompt this level of response suggests the problem may have been festering far longer than authorities would care to admit. The reinvestment of seized assets into frontline policing is symbolically powerful, but also raises practical questions. How much money will actually be recovered? The announcement mentions cases involving hundreds of thousands and millions, but seizing assets from detainment criminals who've had time to hide their proceeds is notoriously difficult. Will this fund a few additional police officers, or will it meaningfully resource enhanced border security operations? The devil, as always, will be in the implementation details that follow these headline announcements. For those working in legitimate immigration advice, these changes should theoretically be welcomed as they may help clear out bad actors tarnishing the profession's reputation. Though one imagines there will be concerns about increased regulatory burden and whether enforcement will be properly targeted at actual criminals rather than catching legitimate practitioners in an overly broad net. The expansion of regulatory powers tends to affect everyone in a sector, not just those it's nominally targeting, and that's something worth monitoring as these provisions come into force. So where does this leave us? The government has announced serious-sounding measures to tackle a genuine problem. Rogue immigration advisors have been operating with apparent impunity, extracting millions from vulnerable people whilst undermining the immigration system. New powers will allow authorities to go after their assets and shut down their operations more effectively. Loopholes that allowed banned advisors to continue operating will be closed. Fines of up to £15,000 will target those posing as qualified professionals when they're nothing of the sort. All of this sounds like progress, and likely is progress, but questions remain about whether it goes far enough, whether it will be properly resourced and enforced, and whether the penalties will genuinely deter criminals who've been making fortunes from these scams. This is exactly the sort of story that requires ongoing scrutiny rather than just accepting press release promises at face value. We'll be watching to see how many prosecutions actually result from these enhanced powers, how much money is actually seized and reinvested, whether the loopholes are genuinely closed or whether new ones emerge, and whether vulnerable migrants are actually better protected as a result. That's what British News Blog does, cutting through the announcements to examine the reality. If you value that approach, subscribe now so you don't miss our continued coverage. This story is far from over, and we'll be here tracking every development, every case, every success, and every failure of this new crackdown. See you in the next one.